So we will start today's class with a discussion of risk and return. So we will start with return as the first topic in our discussion. Good evening, Varun. Good evening, Ekta. So whenever we make any investment, we are looking for some returns from it, or we're looking to make some money out of it. So that money that we make out of it is return. So let's take an example. Suppose there is a company XYZ and its current share price is rupees 100. We buy a share of XYZ and after 1 year the share price of XYZ is rupees 115. So if we had bought one share of XYZ a year back, what would be the return on this investment? So let's try and understand what this would be. So the current value of that share is 115. So if I sell it, I would get 115 rupees and I had invested 100. So how much extra did I get? Rupees 15. Yeah, Varun, that's right. Rupees 15 is what I would get. Second, how much money did I invest? How much money did I invest? So I invested 100 rupees. So I got 15 rupees on an investment of 100 rupees for a year, and hence my return was 15%. Is that clear? Okay. Let's look at another example. Suppose there is a company ABC and its current share price is rupees 200. After 1 year, its share price is say rupees 220, and during the year it gave a dividend of rupees 8. So what would be the return in this case? Let's try and compute it. So I bought the share for 200, I sold it for 220. So how much did I make on selling the share? 20 rupees. Also, I got a dividend of rupees 8. So total how much did I get from it? From this share was 28. And what investment did I make? How much was the investment in this case when I bought one share of ABC? 200. So 28 I earned on an investment of 200, and hence my return was 14%. So in this case, my return was 14%. Is that clear? This amount which has been made from selling the share, the difference between the share price, is known as capital gains. So this is known as capital gains, or it. Okay, and this we have already mentioned is dividend income. Okay, so in a share, typically we have these two kinds of incomes: dividend income and capital gains. Let's try and solve an example which I would want all of you to solve. Suppose there is a company PQR and its current share price is rupees 50. After 1 year, it is rupees 60, and dividend during the year was rupees 4. So what is the return in this case? Can all of you compute and tell me what was the return in this case? If I bought a share of PQR a year back, what was my return in this case? So what was my capital gains? Capital gains we know was 60 minus 50, which is 10, right, Ekta? How much was my dividend income? 4, exactly. So my total income was 14. And how much did I invest? How much did I invest in buying a share of PQR? 50. So what is my return in this case? Exactly. So my return current was 28% return. So is this clear? Great. Now the examples we have done so far, we had only one return. So in all these examples, we knew the return. We had only one scenario in which we knew what was happening. Suppose there are, in a real situation, we don't know what the returns could be or what would be the situation after 1 year. So we would create scenarios. So in such a situation, we create scenarios and we try and compute returns on the basis of those scenarios. So let's look at an example in that context. So let's take this case of company TMP Limited, which is trading at rupees 50. So one share of TMP is at rupees 50. You have created the following scenarios for the next 1 year. If the company does well, it will give us a dividend of rupees 50 and its share price after 1 year is 58. If the company does so, the dividend is rupees 3 and the share price after 1 year would be 53. And if the company does not do well, the dividend is rupees 1 and the share price remains the same. Let's try and compute the returns in all the three scenarios. So in scenario A, what is my dividend? In scenario A, how much dividend do I get? 4. And what is my capital gains? In scenario A, what is my capital gains? 8. So I make 12 on an investment of, how much did I invest in buying one share of? 50. So what is my return in this case? 24%, Varun. So in scenario A, I get a return of 24%. Let's try and compute it for scenario B. What is my dividend? In scenario B, what is my dividend? 3. What is my capital gains? Again 3. So I earn 6 on an investment of 50. So my return in scenario B is 12%. Let's look at scenario C. What is my dividend? 1. What is my capital gains in this case? 0. So I earn 1 on an investment of 50, which is a return of 2%. Exactly, Varun. Additionally, we have been told that you expect the probability of the company doing well to be 50%. So option A, the probability we have assumed is 50% and 25% probability for option B and option C. So the probability in this case is 25% and the probability in this case is 25%. So we have to now compute what is the expected return from buying a share of TMP. So the expected return is the weighted return of all the returns weighted by their probabilities. So it is a probabilistic weighted average. Is that clear to you? So we are weighting the returns by their probabilities. So in scenario A, what is the return? 24%. And what is the probability of scenario A? 50%. Plus scenario B, the return was 12% into a probability which is 25%. Plus scenario C was 2%. Into a probability of again 25%. Is that clear? Okay, so this is how much? So this works out to be 12% plus 3% plus 0.5%, so which is 15.5%. So the expected return from buying a share of company TMP Limited based on these scenarios is 15.5%. Is that clear? Okay, good. Let's do another exercise on expected return before we move to the next topic. So the shares of company ABC are trading at rupees 200, and analyst has created the following scenarios for company ABC regarding dividend payout and share price after 1 year. Optimistic scenario, dividend yield of 12 and share price would be 238 with a probability of 20%. Realistic scenario and a pessimistic scenario. We have to calculate the expected rate of return from buying one share. So let's solve this question. So in the optimistic scenario, can all of you compute what is the return in the optimistic scenario? What would be the return in the case of an optimistic scenario? So Varun says 25%, Karan says that. Let's check. So we have a dividend yield of 12 and a capital gains of 38, which is 50 on an investment of 200, which is 25%. Perfect. And the probability we know in this case of this optimistic scenario is 20%. Let's go to realistic scenario. What is the return in the case of a realistic scenario? In the realistic scenario, what is the return? Okay, 12% is what Karan says. Let's compute. Dividend yield of 12 and capital gains of 12, 212 minus 200. So which is 24 on an investment of 200, which is 12%. Yes, Varun, that's right. Karan, that's right. So probability is 60%. That's what the problem states. In the pessimistic scenario. So what is the return in the case of pessimistic scenario? In the case of pessimistic scenario, what would be the return? Okay, let's compute it. Dividend yield is 4. What is my capital gains? 190 minus 200, which is minus 10. So my capital gains is minus 10. So I make minus 6 on an investment of 200. So it is minus 3%. Yeah, Varun, that's right. Minus 3%. Have all of you understood it? So returns can be positive, negative, 0. They can be anything. Yeah, Karan, that's right. Minus 3%. So in the pessimistic scenario, we make a return, a negative return. And the probability is 20%. So what is the expected return now? Can all of you compute what would be the expected return? What would be the expected return now? So the expected return, as we did in the previous problem, is the weighted return. So the weight is the weighted return of all the returns weighted by their probabilities. So what would be the expected return in this case? So in the optimistic scenario, we have a return of 25% into the weight of it or probability, which is 20%. In realistic, we have 12% and the probability is 60%. And in the pessimistic, we have a return of minus 3% into its probability, which is 20%. Is this how all of you are solving it? Yeah, Ekta, that's perfectly fine. Varun, that's right. So this is 5% plus 7.2% minus 0.6%. So which is 12.2 minus 0.6, which is 11.6%. So is that what all of you are getting? 11.6%. So the expected return from the shares of company ABC are 11.6%. So is the concept of expected return clear to all of you? Any questions regarding expected return? Okay, so now let's move to our next topic, which is risk. So the next topic we would start with is risk. So we have noticed in the last two cases, in this case about company TMP and in ABC, that the returns, there are different scenarios for returns. So we really don't know what the return is. So this variability in return is known as risk. Okay. So as we noticed, when an investment is made, the actual return can vary from the expected return. So even if it was scenario A, B, C in the case of TMP Limited, the actual returns, even if it was any one of these scenarios A, B or C, the return would have been different from the expected return. So when an investment is made, the actual return can vary from the expected return, and this variability is called risk. The higher the variability, the higher the risk. So let's look at some examples. Everybody understands shares. We discussed that. So shares have higher risk as the variability is higher. Fixed deposits, when we put our money in a bank, has lower variability and hence lower risk. So is that concept clear? So because there is variability in our returns, our actual returns can vary from the expected return. That is referred to as risk. Okay. So there are two measures of computing risk, two ways of computing risk. One is called standard deviation and the other is known as coefficient of variation. Okay. So there are two measures of risk that we will study. The first one being standard deviation and the second one being coefficient of variation. So let's start with the first measure, which is standard deviation. Let's go back to our example TMP Limited and try and compute the risk in this case. So in this case we had calculated that the expected return is 15.5%. So have all of you studied standard deviation in your previous courses in school? Yeah, in stats. So standard deviation is, so what is the square of standard deviation known as? Does anybody know what the square of standard deviation? Yeah, variance. So variance is the, or standard deviation is the square root of variance. So standard deviation is the square root of variance. And how do we calculate variance? We calculate variance by taking the actual value and its difference from the mean and squaring it with the expected value of the square of these values. So it is, let's take in this case, what is, so in the scenario A, what is my return? 24%. What was my expected return? 15.5%. So we take the difference, we take the square of the difference and multiply it by the probability, weighted by the probability. Similarly, the next term, 12% minus the mean into its probability, and the third term, which is 2%, is the return. Expected return was 15.5%, the square of it into its probability. Okay, so this is the same as saying sum of actual return, or let's call it return, minus expected return, the square of it into the probability of this return. So that is how we would calculate the variance. In normal, we used to calculate it like this, na, x minus mean to the power 2. So if all of them were equally distributed, we used to calculate the sigma divided by n. You remember this formula, all of you? So this is exactly the same thing we are doing. Instead of dividing by n in this case, we have taken their probabilities, because in that when we use this formula, we had assumed that all the events occur equally probably. So in this case, we are calculating the variance in this way. So this is the variance of the returns, and this, when we solve it to, this comes out to be let me see, what does this come out to be? This comes out to be 0.008475, and the standard deviation is square root of variance, is square root of this term, which is 9.20%. Okay, so the measure of risk as measured by standard deviation for company TMP Limited is 9.2%. So is this methodology clear to all of you? How do we calculate standard deviation? Okay. Now let's move to the next whiteboard. So we had calculated the expected return for ABC. Now can we write down the expression for the variance in this case? For company ABC, if we want to measure risk, we need to first calculate the variance. So can we write the expression in this case? So Varun, 9.2% is a measure of risk which tells us that the distribution. So if I had to draw a distribution of this returns, it gives me how distributed these returns are. And so it is in a classic sense, when we used to talk about mu and sigma in statistics, the expected return is mu and the sigma or standard deviation is 9.2%. So it is a measure of the dispersion of the returns around the mean, around the expected return. When we talk about variance, we will get a better sense about how to use this. Okay. Right now it has only mathematical significance. Right now it gives us a sense of saying, so the higher this value is, the more risk it signifies. So the higher the standard deviation, the more risk it is. So for example, let's just, before we solve this, we solve the return for company PQR. You all remember this example we did? What would be the standard deviation in this case? Can anybody tell me what would be the standard deviation in this case? For PQR, when we had computed the returns, what would be the standard deviation? So understand, in this case we have only one scenario. So in this case, in company PQR, we have only one scenario. Varun, the return is 28%. Standard deviation. So what is standard deviation? The difference between the expected value and the actual value. In this case, there is only one scenario. So what does that mean? That means that actual value is equal to expected value, and hence if that is the case and we have only one value, so variance will be 0 and hence the standard deviation will be 0. Absolutely right, Varun. Okay. So because there is no difference between the expected value and the actual value, the variance in this case is 0. Okay. So let's come back to this problem that we solved about company ABC. Can we calculate the variance in this case? Can we write down the expression for variance in this case? What would be the expression of variance? Remember, we solved the variance in this case where we wrote it as sum of return minus expected return square into probability of return. You remember this? So can we write down the expression for variance here? Let's all of us try to write it. If anybody has written it, can they share it in the chat window? You write on your own while I'm trying to write it. So 25% minus 11.6% to the power 2 into the probability, which is 20%. Plus the next scenario is 12% minus 11.6%. Again to the power 2 into the probability here being 60% plus minus 3% minus 11.6% to the power 2 into the probability of this event being 20%. So is this what all of you are writing on your boards? Yeah, that looks right. So do you all follow it? Okay, that's fine, Varun. So this would be the variance, and if we solve it, and I would suggest after the class all of you should try and solve it. So the variance in this case so this solves to this is equal to, and the standard deviation, which is the square root of variance, is 8.87%. So in this case it is 8.87%. Okay. So is this exercise clear to all of you? So when we talked about here, when we talked about the higher the variability, the more the variability, the higher the risk. So standard deviation, again the same thing. If standard deviation is higher, means risk is higher. Okay. So let's do one exercise, one thought exercise. Suppose we have two investments, ABC and DEF as options. In ABC, the expected return is 15% and the standard deviation, let's call it SD, is 6.5%. In DEF, the expected return is again 15% and the standard deviation is 8.3%. Which one should you choose? So based on standard deviation as a measure of risk, which one should you choose? Should we choose ABC or should we choose DEF? Okay, and why should we choose ABC? Why should we choose ABC? Anyone? Okay, so first thing we would note that the expected return is the same. So between both these cases, the expected return is the same, which is 15%. Now for the same expected return, ABC has lesser standard deviation and hence lesser risk. So for the same expected return, ABC has lesser standard deviation and lesser risk. Hence we would choose ABC. So hence we would choose ABC. So Varun, that also probably gives you an idea to the question you had asked earlier. So this is one of the applications of standard deviation as a measurement of risk. Now this also throws up another question. Now in real life, the expected returns will not be the same. It's hard to imagine that expected returns will be the same. So how do we evaluate it? So for this we have something which we call, which is the second measure, which is the coefficient of variation. And the coefficient of variation is the standard deviation divided by the expected return. So the standard deviation divided by the expected return is the coefficient of variation. Okay. Now, would higher the coefficient variation mean more risk or less risk? So if coefficient of variation is higher, and we will call this as CV, is higher, it means more risk or lower risk? What does this imply in your opinion? More risk or lesser risk? Would it imply higher risk or lower risk if the coefficient of variation is higher? So if it's standard deviation, suppose the returns in two cases are the same. So if coefficient of variation is higher, means standard deviation is higher. So this would imply higher risk. Okay. So if coefficient of variation is higher, implies higher risk. So this is a way now in which we can compare two returns and say which one has lesser risk. And this would not also require that the expected returns is the same. Is that clear? Let's do a quick exercise around this concept. Okay, Rohit is evaluating 4 investment options. The expected return in all the options is 12%. The standard deviation in the options are 8.2%, 14.5%, 16.9% and 9.2% respectively. Which option should Rohit choose? First, second, third or fourth, and why? Which option should Rohit choose? So the returns in all these cases is the same. So if returns are the same, the lower the standard deviation means lower risk. So we will choose the one with the lowest standard deviation. So which is the one with the lowest standard deviation? The first choice. So he should go with the first choice. Yeah. Yeah, exactly, Shivani. Okay. Let's do another problem. So Joe is evaluating the following investment options. Option 1, 2, 3 and 4. Which option should Joe choose? So can all of you help me solve this problem? Which option should Joe choose? So how will we solve it? In each case we will calculate the coefficient of variation. So in option 1, CV is equal to, what will be CV in this case? What had we defined CV to be? Standard deviation by expected return, which is 5% by 12%, which is 0.41. Option 2, what will be CV? Can all of you tell me what will be CV in option 2? Yeah, 7 by 14, exactly Shivani, which is 0.5. In option 3, what will be CV? What will be CV in option 3? Yeah, Karan, so it will be 4 by 9, which is 0.44, exactly. Option 4, 7 by 16, which is equal to 0.4375. So which option should Joe choose? So in this case, which option should Joe choose? Yes, so the lowest CV is in option 1, which is 0.41. So we should choose option 1 in this case. So one of the standard ways of measuring portfolios is we use coefficient of variation because it normalizes it over expected return. So one of the standard ways of comparing options is using coefficient of variation. Okay, is that clear? Great. So there are a lot of exercises on the Trisect portal. So I would suggest after the class, all of you should go ahead and do those exercises, solve all these problems, and if there is any issue, we can take up, we can discuss it in the next class, and you can also write to the Trisect teaching fellows and take help from them. Okay, is that clear? Any questions so far? Does anybody have any questions so far? Okay, great. So that's fantastic.